You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
I want to talk in this segment about a few related stories from the last week that aren't even really newsworthy at this point. I mean, they're newer innovations in what are basically becoming the norms that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. This historic figure being canceled, this monument being defaced, all under the auspices of trying to make people who lived in the 1900s, the 1800s, the 1700s, the 4000 BCs or whatever, make them all live up to the standards that we set out for how you're supposed to be in 2021. And John A. Macdonald, I've talked about John A. Macdonald's legacy numerous times on the show. Here's a guy who was Canada's founder. Without him, there would be no Canada. This is something that a lot of people who don't understand the country's history do not realize, that John A. Macdonald staked a lot of political capital on the idea of a Canadian Confederation and had to continue to do so to his own personal detriment to hold Confederation together. And because we are now in this moment in time where we keep reevaluating and reassessing, even when no one of substance is really talking about these issues, we now have to continue this defense. Jason Kenney, the Premier of Alberta, was asked at a press conference this week what he thinks of statues of John A. Macdonald. And to his credit, he gave a very detailed answer about the importance of standing up for Canadian history. I'm not going to play the whole 7 minutes. If you want to see that, if you're a glutton for punishment and you like watching 7 minutes of political press conferences, you can head on over to my Twitter page. I posted it there. But I'll play a snippet here because he actually takes a stand against cancel culture and is correct to point out that that's what it is that's driving this assault on John A. Macdonald.
If we want to get into canceling every figure in our history who took positions on issues at the time that we now judge harshly and rightly in historical retrospective. But if that's the new standard, then I think almost the entire founding leadership of our country gets canceled. Tommy Douglas, who recommended the use of eugenics to sterilize the weak, as he said, if we talk about members of the famous five, heroes of Canadian feminism and the fight for equality for women. Some of them were advocates of eugenics that we would now regard as deplorable. So if we go full force into cancel culture, then we're canceling most, if not all, of our history. Instead, I think we should learn from our history. We should learn from our achievements, but also our failures.
So very well said, Premier Kenney. And by sharing that, I got a whole bunch of backlash from people, activists that were saying that, this is insensitive to the bodies that were just found at that large grave site at the Kamloops residential school, as though these two things are related. A point that bears repeating here is that the absence of perfection from historic figures does not equate to the presence of evil. And a lot of the folks who are trying to drive these cancel campaigns of historic figures are actually trying to cancel history itself, a phenomenon in most cases they don't seem to understand. We can accept the darkness and dark chapters of Canada's history while also looking at the broader story that is Canada. And John A. Macdonald, in no uncertain terms, cannot be classified as a villain when you have an objective assessment of Canada's history. But that doesn't matter. Like I said, no one's interested in facts. Ryerson University, named after Egerton Ryerson, is going through this. The journalism school's publications are being renamed ahead of the next school year, dropping any reference to the school name itself. There are currently two publications, the Ryerson Review of Journalism and the Ryersonian Newspaper, and because they say that Egerton Ryerson was indisputably one of the architects of the residential school system, they're going to change these names. Now, if you really want to make a stand, why don't you resign from Ryerson? Why don't you rip up your degree with Ryerson on it? Why don't you really go all the way if you're insistent on destroying the legacy, which is now the school's legacy as much as it's a part of the country's legacy? Now, look, I'm a firm believer in the fact that people can make their own decisions to associate with whomever they want. The Egerton Ryerson statue was defaced just a day prior to the news outlets or media organizations at Ryerson making that call. I do not support the vandalism that takes place there. The Edmonton Eskimo. Oh, no, sorry, you can't say that. Okay, Let's try this again. The Edmonton Elks, as they're now known. They just announced the new name for the team a year after announcing they would change the name of the formerly Eskimos, the artists formerly known as Eskimos. And it was odd. This change happened, like a lot of other changes, in the wake of the George Floyd protests, as though there's a direct connection between this very brutal takedown by police in Minnesota and a longstanding CFL team in Canada. But the problem is that this comes in waves, and I mentioned on the show earlier this week that the activist mob doesn't really care about the individual circumstances that they decide to pipe up over. They see this all as one big prolonged war, and any individual battle, no matter how insignificant it may be to them, they will take up. But cumulatively, these things are significant because at the end of it, you have, well, the Ryerson newspapers have changed their name. This is going to apply pressure to every other school newspaper that might have a historic figure in the name to change that, and so on. And eventually, there's not going to be all that much left, because one thing that the left does very well is move right on to the next fight without losing any momentum. So that's why it's so important to stand up for John A. Macdonald, to stand up for the country's history, because it's not just about drawing the line around a few, the word they use is problematic figures. It is genuinely about anyone who had the misfortune of living in a time prior to now. That is no longer compatible with 2021. If you liked watching this clip of The Andrew Lawton Show, True North has lots more for you all over at www.tnc.news.